All right, hello everybody. Thank you for tuning in and for your interest in learning more about the 2025 operating levy referendum here in Waconia Public Schools. My name is Matt Thomas and I'm the Director of Communications here for the school district. And this video is just a recorded session that we'll be sharing on the resources page of our referendum website. And our goal is to provide more information for people in a way that's convenient for you so that you can watch and learn at a time that works best for your schedule. So we're excited to kick things off today with two important voices in our district. First, we're joined by Waconia High School teacher and president of the Waconia Education Association, Roxanne Kirschner. And then we also have Superintendent Brian Gersich with us. And with that, I'll hand things over to Superintendent Gersich to get us started.
Thanks, Matt. And thanks to everyone for taking some time to learn a little bit about our referendum. As Matt said, my name is Brian Gersich. I am the superintendent for Waconia Public Schools. Super excited to have that role in that capacity within our community. The purpose of our video is to really help highlight and give some high-level information about our referendum and try to answer some of the questions that people ask as they learn more about that vote coming up. So that's going to certainly include some of our history, a little bit about our current reality, some of the future, and just a high-level summary of, why is this question before the voters? As I enter into that, what I also want to do is try to set the stage for some of the slides you'll see in the presentation, which includes survey results. And at the bottom left of the screen, you'll notice that some of them will be noted with the Morris Leatherman Community Survey. That's an independent survey that was commissioned by the board last spring to really understand some of the atmospherics or the reputation of the district. How does the community feel about its public schools, as well as understanding the support in the community for potential funding requests, which certainly is a part of what resulted from this fall, helping the board understand what would the community support, if anything, when it came down to requests for funding. But starting with some of those results from the Morris Leatherman survey, you'll notice on the screen that 91% of the residents responded that the quality of education provided by Waconia Public Schools is either excellent or good. 88% agree that the district is receiving a good value from its investment in public schools, and 87% of the residents in the survey said that they trusted the school board and the administration to do what's right for the children in the district. I'm starting my fourth year, and as I've talked with the people who've worked in our district for many years, we've always felt a strong sense of community support within our public schools. And it's really nice to see that the survey results really did help to validate and qualify some of that feeling of community support. It's important for us schools to acknowledge that we really do believe that strong public schools play a role in creating strong communities. But what we enjoy in Waconia Public Schools is also super strong community support, which helps create some of our strong schools as well, with the partnerships and the opportunities that are provided by the community within our schools. And so what we enjoy in Waconia is a positive reinforcement loop between our schools and our community that we feel very proud of and very proud to be a part of. What brings us here today is that we are at a bit of a financial crossroads for District 110. And as we look at some of the projections and some of the information I'll provide later, I'll give some details as to what that looks like. School funding is a part of a legislative process, meaning every 2 years we have an understanding from the legislature as to how schools are funded from the state. And state funding largely has not kept up with inflation over the years. And this is something where even some of the questions that we get talk about some of the new funding that has come to schools, and it's important to acknowledge that often that new revenue from the state comes with new expectations for how it is spent. So we're not alone. There are many districts, including some in our general area, that are going to the voters for additional revenues. Some are cutting budgets. Some are doing both, and there are districts out there that can't go out for new money because they've been capped at the state max, and we'll look at some of those examples. Again, I'm not here to tell their stories. I'm here to tell the story of Waconia Public Schools and some of the specifics behind ours, but helping to acknowledge that there are other districts that are in a similar place. Our referendum, our request is not about trying to find new exciting things or to bring in the latest, greatest program. This is really about maintaining what we believe matters most to our district, which is the people who work here, the programs that people are excited to be a part of, and certainly protecting class sizes that are important to our kids, to our community, and to our staff. And the first one of those is prioritizing people. And what we understand is that in public education, nobody went into these fields to become rich. but we need to make sure that we are competing and recruiting high quality staff and by offering competitive salaries and benefits to make sure that we are retaining the people in a competitive market for education. Um, with that, what I do want to do is bring in the voice of Roxanne Kirshner, who's been great at offering some of the teacher perspective when it comes down to this and the competitive nature and what it means to, work to prioritize people within our district.
All right, thank you for having me here today. It has changed a lot. I've been in the teaching field for 32 years now, and it used to be that the school that you started at was probably the school that you ended at. Teachers did not move from district to district to district because it was hard to match the wage if you went to another district. But with the teacher shortage that everywhere has, that is not the case anymore. A lot of schools are in the market to hire experienced teachers, so we need to match the pay of districts around us so that we can keep the teachers that we have at Waconia so that they start here and they feel supported here and they end here. Because like I said, it's not the same as it used to be. Teachers can now, like people that are in the business world, can go shop around, look for better opportunities at other districts. And we don't want that to happen. We want the teachers to feel like Waconia is the best opportunity, that this is the district that they want to have their entire career at. We need to keep these quality teachers.
Thank you, Roxanne. And we know for people who've paid attention and been a part of Waconia schools that if we look back a couple of years ago, we had a difficult round of negotiations with our employees. And we acknowledge that, but we have been working together in partnership to create, fair, competitive, comparable districts and create a vision for what it looks like to have a competitive salary and benefits. We understand and know there are some districts we cannot compete with, but we must compete with the districts that we can so we are retaining the quality staff. And again, a part of that we recognize we need to do some market correcting because of where the district has been. Again, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but making sure that we have that opportunity to invest and also having manageable class sizes, which also impacts the experience of our teachers. When I go back to these surveys, this one is not a Morris Leatherman survey. This is a survey we give within our district each spring. And last spring, 95% of our teachers and staff say that they're proud to work for District 110. And 93% of the residents back to that Morris Leatherman independent survey rated the performance of our teachers and instructional staff as excellent or good. We like to make sure people realize our teachers and staff are proud to be here, and the community says that they are doing a fantastic job educating our kids. We have to have competitive salaries and benefits in a very competitive market to ensure that we attract and retain that quality staff. What we're also looking to do with this referendum is to preserve programs. Back to our survey, in addition to the quality teachers that we have, when residents are asked what they like most about their schools, they talk about our academics and our programs and curriculars. That's both in and out of the classroom. And 91% of our students would say that they are engaged in their school. We want to continue to be able to offer those things. And if we have to reduce our budget, what is at risk is a lot of those programs and opportunities, particularly within our secondary site. It is about those electives and those enriched opportunities that tend to have some lower enrollments that become at risk. It makes it more difficult to run those classes. And certainly the through line through everything is protecting class sizes. Class sizes impacts the experience certainly of our staff and manageable workloads. And it impacts the experience of our kids, both in the context of they've got additional classmates and don't get that same level of attention within the classroom. But we also know in Waconia schools, we have students that are very motivated and competitive. And what they strive for is feedback. And that feedback becomes difficult to give when teachers have additional students in the classroom. When we went through budget reductions in 2023, we were really largely able to protect the main class sizes of our elementary students. If we need to do budget reductions again, it becomes very difficult to protect those class sizes again. Because what happens if the referendum is voted down? We have to repeat that process, but we don't have nearly as many options to reduce our budget. And therefore, we know it's going to impact people. We will have to have staffing reductions. We know when we did an analysis within fair comparisons, we need to invest in our salaries and benefits with a market correction to catch back up to where we really should be for competitive salaries and benefits. And certainly the impact of class sizes, the through line, is going to be additional management within our classrooms and for our staff. People might ask, why do we cut so many staffing? Why not cut from other areas? 80% of our budget is tied to staffing by salaries and benefits. We are a human service profession. We cannot make significant reductions without it impacting staffing. And certainly, again, that impacts our programming and the opportunities that we talked about before in the through line of class sizes are things that end up having to be increased. So what is the question before the voters? It is an operating referendum of $731 per pupil, which equates to roughly $3 million annually over the next 10 years, which would also include an inflationary factor. In a minute, I'm going to get into some additional pieces of actual financial side of some of the questions that we would receive. But I'm going to pause just for a second and see if, Matt, if I've missed anything to date, or if Roxanne, if there's anything you'd want to provide.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we could bring Roxanne back in really quick, just to go back to that class size piece. I think, Roxanne, you offer some good perspective when Brian's talking about class sizes, how a class size of 25 to 35 can make a difference, not just for you as a teacher, but for the students in your classroom.
Well, yeah, I mean, it used to be, when I first started here teaching in the sciences, we would kind of cap our classes, try to keep it around 24 for labs and give those kids a really good experience. And that was in all of the classes. We were able to do that, but Waconia has been growing since then, luckily and thankfully. But now I have class sizes of 36. And it's just hard to get around to all of those students during work time to give them some one-on-one attention, which Waconia kids have. They're so motivated and they really thrive on that student and teacher contact. I mean, what student doesn't, right? So when you have a class of 36 in any field, it's just hard to give those kids that one-on-one attention in the classroom. And then also it's now you have more of their work, more labs, more tests to correct throughout the day, to give that feedback in a timely manner. And as everybody knows, that's the only way that students can, one of the only ways that they can improve is to have meaningful feedback. And with large class sizes, that just gets really difficult.
Thanks, Roxanne. Okay, Brian, do you want to get back into some of the financial side of this? We'll talk about where we get some of our money. We'll talk about the tax impact of this referendum. We'll get into a bunch of different things on the financial side here.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So starting with a high-level understanding, where does the district get our money? The largest portion of the district's revenue comes from the state of Minnesota at about 78%. What's important for people to understand is that within the context of money from the state, schools are not funded the same. So if you look at the starting point for what we get from the state, Waconia Public Schools, and you'll notice some of the districts in our area, starts in the bottom 2% of all districts in the state for revenue on a per pupil basis coming from the state. The student is not a student when funded from the state. There are different categories of funding that depend on what a student may qualify for. One of the largest categories is compensatory money, which is a measure of additional money for students who tend to qualify for free or reduced price lunch. That's just one of many categories, but it's a starting point, which clearly, hopefully people understand, makes us more dependent on the local community when it comes down to funding to support our schools. There's also some general myths that we're trying to help people understand within the community, because we hear this often. People have this tendency to think that because Waconia is growing, it must mean we're getting additional revenue, and it must mean we're getting additional students. The starting point is to remember is that when it comes down to our funding from an operating perspective, it is based on how many students that we have. So if we have more students, we do get more funding. Outside of that, we do not. Within our community, we have to understand that more houses don't automatically mean more students. There are certainly social changes in that there are fewer kids per household. I've had conversations with our local hospital before, with our officials there, who help us understand that even in spite of the growth of Carver County, the total number of births has remained relatively flat. So we have to understand there are fewer kids per household. And technically right now, if we look at our audit reports, there are fewer school-aged children living in our district than have been over the years. The other thing to understand is with all these new houses, who's buying them? Are they young families coming in and having kids within our schools? Or I've met a number of people who've told me that they've moved here to be around their grandkids, not necessarily to be having kids. Now, certainly with the growth of the housing in our community, I expect that we will see our student population grow. But right now, that has not happened. The other thing that people try to think about or try to understand is how the schools are not getting more money with all these new houses paying taxes. And it comes back to remembering what I said on the front end. Our funding is determined on the number of students. And so when houses come in and are built, unless they bring in new students, yes, they're paying taxes to the school, but what that's doing is it's putting it into the same pie or taking it from the same pie as the district is already getting, which kind of dilutes everyone else's shares. And so again, if many people were to look at their tax statements over time, you'll notice over the last few years, for many, including the house that I had, school portions of the property tax statements have been declining, albeit slightly, well, even though the overall tax bill has been going up. So it's important to understand that new houses don't necessarily bring new money to the schools. It is about students. Thinking about how we spend our money. Regular and special education, as well as pupil and instructional support, direct services to our students takes up more than 3/4 of our budget. A number of people ask about administrative costs, and I totally understand that because we want to keep those resources close to our students. But I want to make sure people understand that when it comes to Waconia Public Schools, I've done a lot of analysis on how districts spend per pupil. And if I look at site level administration, the people at the building level, like our principals and assistant principals, Waconia schools spend less on a per student basis than any district I've ever been able to find. And I have not run the analysis for all 330 districts in the state. I have done this for a number of years in different districts of different size, and I have not found one that spends less per pupil on site level administration. And I've only found one statewide, you'll see it's not in our comparison, that spends less on total administration on a per pupil basis than Waconia schools. I do believe we've done a nice job keeping our administrative costs low, which is important, I realize. The other thing I said earlier is that about 80% of our budget is in salaries and benefits. You'll notice from this graph, 77.5% of our district funds goes towards salaries and benefits. The next largest portion of our spending is for purchase services, which includes Southwest Metro, where we send some of our students for specialized programming, and transportation, and certainly within those, costs are also salaries and benefits. Again, we're a human service profession. That's why it's very difficult to ever reduce our budget with any substance without impacting salaries and benefits, is because that's how we spend our funds. This is a graphic that shows the general fund balance history for Waconia schools. I bring it up to say that I acknowledge that there are some unique things about the Waconia schools funding and spending history. And we totally understand that there's a story there to tell. Our goal today is to focus forward. But if people would like more information about what happened, why was the district in debt for so long? There are resources on our website, including a forensic audit report that was ordered by the school board in the fall of 2021. And other presentation materials to help people understand. The bottom line is it was increasing expenses with flat revenues, which is essentially saying overspending of our budget. And again, we acknowledge that, but you'll see through here, I believe we've taken several steps to correct that process and ensure that we are living within our means as a district. So looking at a little bit of the timeline of the district, our community has been generous when it comes down to offering additional operating funds. And in 2018, as we entered into statutory operating debt for the first time, the district passed a $525 per student operating levy. And then during the pandemic, 2 years later, another $410 per student. Both of those came with inflationary factors and were to run for 10 years with the acknowledgement that in the 2023 legislative session, school boards can extend those for another 10 years. So for the same duration and same amount. So in theory, those could be pushed out for another 10 years beyond their original. You'll notice again too, 525 plus inflation, 410 plus inflation. So when we get to the next slide and say, where does that put us? You'll see that that's larger than the sum of those two numbers because of the inflationary factors. This is where, from an operating perspective now, Waconia Schools compares to some of our neighbors. And as I said before, there are some districts. So if you look at the Minnetonka on this graph, they are maxed out in their local ability to approve additional operating funding for their schools. They can't go to the voters if the voters would say yes. So where does that put us now from a ranking perspective? Waconia Schools, based on that, comes to the top of the lowest quartile. And if you'll notice, those other two comparisons that started at relatively 11% and 2%, about where we were, now go into the top half of funding. That is just from operating funds. What many districts also have is what's called a capital projects levy, also a voter-approved source of money. Often what's that used for and became very popular for is technology costs. Waconia Schools takes our technology costs out of our general fund. Other districts have a different revenue stream to pay for those. So if you look at West Tonka all the way to the right, and I have nothing against West Tonka, they are good people and they do a nice job, and I used to work there, so I'm not picking on them. This is just a comparison from a budget perspective. In the previous slide, we showed how West Tonka ends up roughly $1,000 per student more than Waconia when it comes down to our operating funds. So $1,000 per student times about 4,000 students is about $4 million. In addition, they have the equivalent of roughly $1,000 per student for their capital projects or their technology. So that's another roughly $4 million if it was equivalent, for a total of $8 million of equivalent funding if it was the same per student between those two districts. So again, that's why it is oftentimes difficult to compete. And I do believe Waconia Schools does a nice job competing when we have that kind of difference in our funding and our resources. So as you go back to our timeline, I was hired in the summer of 2022. And in 2023, which was my first year here, we decided to go for $4.6 million worth of budget adjustments, which is largely cuts. I bring it up in the timeline to note that there were a number of people within the community who wanted the district and advised the board we should go for an operating referendum at that time. It was my recommendation and certainly the belief of the board that that would not be prudent. We had a history, in spite of bringing in additional revenue, of not spending our way back into a healthy financial position. This graphic generally I've used to demonstrate how we brought in new revenue streams of $2 million plus in that first operating referendum that passed during the 18-19 school year. So that would be FY19. So the new money comes in thereafter. An additional in the 2021 school year. And in spite of that, we made up $400,000 of debt with roughly $12 million new dollars coming into the district. We understood we needed to live within our means and demonstrate what it looks like. That's why those budget reductions happened. And they were largely across the board, and we tried to cut as equitably across our system as we could. But again, we acknowledge it was a lot of people because that's where we spend our money, salaries and benefits. We've tightened up that belt and we've lived within our means. The other factor that came into play, and I mentioned before, we had some difficult negotiations within our employee groups, which I think people should have some empathy, realizing that our employees work really hard and the community says they do a nice job. And in spite of that, when we go in and have our bargaining groups negotiate and the district continues to be in a negative financial position, that gets frustrating. And thanks in large part to their willingness to look at this differently. And we, instead of doing the typical 2-year contract settlements, which is what you would see in most districts, we did 2 consecutive 2-year contracts, acknowledging that our employees got little to no increases in salaries and benefits in that first contract, with deferring a lot of those increases until the second contract. Again, and also acknowledging that that will still likely leave us behind where we need to be. That, with our budget reductions and a mild winter, really did help us achieve that first positive fund balance since 2017. And it's just notable too, realistically, by policy, we should have almost $3 million fund balance. That's a 5% of our total expenditures by district policy. Healthy school districts should really have 8 to 10%. So that really means we should have closer to between $5 and $6 million of a fund balance so that we can sustain through the life happen moments of, cold winters and people who are sick or other kinds of things that happen within the course of a year. Again, I've infused some of that Morris Leatherman survey that was given in the spring of 2025, and we're now asking the community for support. And many people might ask, if we now have a positive fund balance, if now we're moving in the direction, we believe we've tightened up the belt, why is it we need to ask for additional support? It's that we start to look at the projections. We have to think about our funding in a long-term way, not year by year. And we see in FY27, which is the 26-27 school year, we start to deficit spend again. We continue to build up our fund balance, but then we see that tipping down, that turning point that we'll talk about as to the why here in a second. That gap, which again, we have already not achieved where we need to be from a fund balance perspective, is the problem. And there are two ways to correct that problem. There's two ways to make sure that we don't go back into a deficit spending position. The first path is to increase revenue. That's what the referendum is about, is to ask for additional resources from the community to plug that gap. The other path is to reduce expenses, reductions. And so again, that is why I say what happens, or first, I'm sorry, it was earlier in the slide when I say what happens if it does not pass. We have to reduce expenses, which is cuts, which is largely staffing, class sizes, and programs and opportunities. Why do we see that downturn? Again, higher costs associated with those salaries and benefits. Salaries and benefits that we also understand still need a market correction within them. Those were deferred raises in the structure of that deal, which allowed us to work our way onto the positive side of our balance sheet, with still the need to continue to address that. We have increased costs associated with purchase services, the largest of which is transportation. We have a fantastic partner for the transportation of our kids, with drivers who love kids, and a business that does a great job treating us well as a partner. But we understand their costs go up, and as the customer, our costs go up as well. So that is a significant increase that we're seeing. Mandates when it comes down to additional costs that we have to pay for teacher retirement association, payroll tax. That's any business in Minnesota understands the need to budget for payroll tax and general inflation of goods that people are seeing. And with that coupled also relatively flat revenue. We have a very slight, fairly stable, but a slightly declining enrollment, and legislative funding that we talked about on the front end. More recently, there are some reductions in revenues that districts will be getting for funding, which certainly impacts, and we must plug that from the general fund as well. So again, as we come back around to a little bit of that timeline, we project a negative fund balance. We do not intend to go into debt again. We need to manage our budget, and that's a decision we will certainly be recommending to the board, but there's two ways to prevent that from happening: increasing revenues or decrease expenditures. That's what our referendum is about. Again, prioritizing people, preserving programs, and protecting class sizes. People may ask, so what is that going to cost the homeowner? The median priced home in the Waconia Public Schools area is $450,000. The cost of that would be roughly $27 per month. A homeowner can also go to our website, follow this QR code, and you can look up your home. You could go into one of the two counties and put in your address, get your parcel information, plug that in, and it would give an estimate of what the property tax impact would be on your specific home as well. The last thing I'm going to note here, and then I'm going to ask Matt and Roxanne once again if they want to add anything to this, is voting information. Voting is now open, and so people have the opportunity to vote once they know, all the way up through Election Day on November 4th. I think it's important just to note, this is the only question on the referendum. And so once people have an understanding of how they feel and what their opinion is on the Waconia Schools referendum, we encourage you to vote and to cast that ballot. I know in other election years, sometimes people want to wait for the debate between a couple of other candidates that are also on the ballot so they can understand who they want to vote for in all areas. And I would say I certainly understand as a voter myself that I would do that. In this situation, we have information available. This is the only question on the ballot. So we encourage you, once you know your opinion, you have that opportunity to cast that ballot. All right, I am going to pause, and I'm going to ask Matt and certainly Roxanne if you have anything too. Are there anything that I've missed or things that we need to clarify?
Thank you, Brian. The only thing that I want to share with people is if you're seeking more information, there is a website out there. It's www.isd110referendum.org. Again, that's isd110referendum.org. And also check your mailboxes. You should also be getting a couple informational fact-based pieces over the next 30 to 45 days in your mailboxes as a resident of the district. And obviously, if you have questions that myself or Superintendent Gersich can answer, we do also have an email address set up where people can email in questions. And that is isd110vote@isd110.org.